recording. And if you see your little window, you can click on that so it goes away. So as we get started tonight, it is always appropriate and good for us to begin with prayer. So please join me in prayer. Oh, gracious and loving God, you call us to care for one another and to be filled with care, careful of one another. That is one of the ways we show our love for you and our love for our neighbors. And in the world we are in, it's important for us to be able to do that in well thought out and yes, formal ways. So even though it feels like we shouldn't have to do this in the church, we are a church made up of human beings. And Lord, you know, we have all sinned and fallen short of your glory. None of us may boast. And so we take care. We create care-filled, careful policies. And we do so out of love and an abundance of caution. So be with us as we discuss that tonight and as we are open to thinking through in new ways and old ways how to care for one another. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, I'm going to share my screen. There we go. Woohoo! Safe church policies. And the reason I wanted to touch on this now is we were preparing for our session minutes review this year. I got a question, what's a safe church policy? And I thought, well, that sounds like a good topic for conversation. So for some of you, this may be just review. I am hoping to invite you to think about this in some different ways, which is why I've added these categories of property, people, and finances. So I'm going to move through this. Feel free to interrupt with questions, or if you want, my plan is to have a good 10 to 15 minutes at the end where we can ask questions and talk with one another. So this is what the Book of Order says. Each council, and a council is a session, a presbytery has a council, and in this presbytery, the presbytery itself acts as the council. The synod has a council. General Assembly has a council. Each council shall develop a manual of administrative operations that will specify the form and guide the work of mission in that council. And I am including that language to remind us that when we talk about things like safe church policies, that's related to our mission. It is related to our ministry. It's not simply this requirement. It is part of how we are the body of Christ. And all councils shall adopt and implement, important piece, implement a sexual misconduct policy and a child and youth protection policy. And so if you go to the presbytery's manual, you will see both of those policies as part of our manual. And you can reference that. So that is an easy initial shortcut. If you as a session don't have either a misconduct prevention policy, I like to add that language, it's about preventing misconduct, or a child, youth, vulnerable adult protection policy, you can reference the presbyteries and take that as a first step. You know, move that the session of XYZ church shall be guided by the prevention policy and protection policies adopted by the presbytery. So you can do that and then begin working on a policy that makes sense for your context, that makes sense for your mission and ministry and where you are as a church and a congregation now. So that is the requirement. But I want to start with property. I want to start with something that we may not automatically think about when we think about safe church policies, because the language is about misconduct prevention and vulnerable children, youth, vulnerable adult protection. But our properties can be a place that we forget or may forget to pay attention to when it comes to safety. So I want to begin there to invite us to think through briefly some various levels of property safety. And a piece of that is deciding as a session, who's responsible? So it's a really good thing to talk about fire extinguishers and smoke alarms, right? But who is assigned that task? And please, please, I beg of you, please do not say the pastor. And on behalf of our clerks of session here, please don't say the clerk of session either. Although that may be the best person in your system and your congregation, the clerk of session may be the best person to task with some of these things. But I mean, just that simple piece of conversation, who makes sure the fire extinguishers are up to date, are charged or replaced as they need to be replaced, and that the smoke alarms are active and working. That can be part of a safe church policy. It is literally part of your safety. Who checks to make sure that your entrances and exits are clearly marked? Is there emergency lighting in the case of a power failure? We, in my previous position, especially in Massachusetts, the fire department started showing up and checking on congregations. They were no longer going to be grandfathered in because, it can be really awful if there's a fire at the church or an emergency, a building emergency, and someone is hurt because the signage wasn't up or there were no emergency lights. We have a lot of older church structures in this presbytery, but it is still worth having this conversation. Is there a way to provide clear guidance for exits and entrances? Is there a way to provide emergency lighting, even if it's just like having some flashlights? I preached at a congregation, and I forget, I think it was Fifth Avenue. It was Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church, and I did not preach there. I just walked into the pulpit because I'm that kind of person. And they had one of those huge like spotlight flashlights under the pulpit. And I thought, they're ready. If something happens, Fifth Avenue Presbyterian, downtown New York City, they have that. So there are ways to provide for some lighting in the case of an emergency. Do you have an alarm system? You may not need one. You may be a congregation that leaves the doors unlocked. That's okay. Have you talked about it? Is that part of your policy? Have you made a conscious decision about windows and doors, locks, alarms? What areas are accessible? What areas are closed? Those kinds of things can be part of a safe church property, especially, again, a lot of churches decide to keep doors locked if only one person's in the building. So formalize that. So it's not a surprise. And if somebody complains, well, I came by and the door was locked, you can say, yes, we do that as part of our safe church policy. So you may not think of these kinds of things as part of a safe church policy, but in the overarching realm of safety and caring for one another, these kinds of property questions can, and I would say should be considered. Continuing on that line, property concerns related to the seasons and weather. I haven't been through winter here yet, but we talked a lot in northern New England about pipes freezing, about those outside faucets that were opened up during the summer. Who is responsible? Who's responsible for those kinds of things. How do you help people be aware, especially as you may have elders who are rotating off of session, or members who have been that repository of knowledge? If you have one member who knows how to restart the boiler when it goes down, that person should teach a few other people. So those kinds of things, and even the kinds of instructions, if you have particular systems that are a little temperamental, do you have a place where the information is kept, is accessible? Something to think about. What about violent storms? Who helps prepare the church property if a violent storm is predicted? And we know that part of climate change is more violent weather events. It wasn't that long ago, there were tornadoes that came through the peninsula. So an opportunity to think through, how do we respond? How do we prepare for violent weather? How do we respond during violent weather? And how do we respond after violent weather? Always with the prayer that you will never, ever, ever need to use it. But you want to have those conversations before the storm is predicted, not the day of. And then, who checks on the building? Who checks on the building in case there is an extended power outage, and perhaps freezing pipes or other kinds of things? Like if you have a really sensitive music system, an organ that can't stand high fluctuations in temperature, who checks? Do you have a way to see if the building is in good shape? There are more and more thermostats that allow for remote access. Now they have to be online, which means you need power. But I have known of churches that had the thermostat that sent an alarm when the temperature in the building dropped below a certain level. Again, much colder winters where I've been living before, but it actually averted some potential catastrophes because someone was checking and got that alarm and was able to go see what was going on at the building. So these are some of the things that can be part of an overarching safe church policy. Also, when it comes to property, to talk about when the building is occupied. So it's one thing when the building is empty, but what about when the building is occupied? Do you have a plan for evacuation in case of a fire or other emergency? When do you review that? The last church I served, we actually, at the end of worship once a year, had everyone sit down and we talked about our plan for evacuating. The sanctuary was on the second floor. There were multiple staircases. And so we would talk the congregation through. If there's an emergency here, we go this way. If there's an emergency here, we go this way. This is how we will organize ourselves. This is where we will gather outside in the case of an emergency while we're in the building together. Our kids do it in school. Why shouldn't we do it as part of being safe together at the church? And then how do you communicate that to other groups that use the building? How do you make sure, if others use the building on a regular basis, that they know where a gathering point is outside? Those kinds of things can be exceptionally helpful, because once you're in the midst of the emergency, everything's so chaotic. Knowing in advance is a way of protecting everyone. Do you have a safe place identified in case of a violent storm? If you're in worship and suddenly a siren goes off, a storm's approaching, where do you go? How do you go? What is the policy? What's the procedure? And if you haven't already, to know if you have a space in the church that can serve as a shelter for others in the community in the case of something where there's more time to prepare, Are you a place where people can shelter during a storm? Or are you a place where people could shelter after an emergency, where people could gather and meet with representatives from the Red Cross and other aid associations? Again, having these kinds of conversations in advance help identify how you can be a center of ministry and mission in your community. And it means you are a little more prepared. And just in case, if your building is more than one story and you can't use the stairs, how will people leave the upper stories in the case of an emergency? Now, some of these particular things, Presbyterian Disaster Assistance has some good resources for preparing for potential disasters. And they include conversation topics and ways to think through some of the ins and outs of these things. And I'm going to make myself a note right now because I did not include it in my list of resources for this training. That I'll include the PDA, Presbyterian Disaster Assistance resources. So that's property. We also talk about safe church policies for people, and that may be the more familiar topic when we talk about safe church policies. As I said at the beginning, all councils are required to have a policy for responding to sexual misconduct, for providing protection of youth, children, and vulnerable adults. So there's a good starting point. Do you have one? If not, like I said, you can reference the presbyteries so you have something that you will be guided by until you are able to adopt one that fits for your congregation and your situation. If you do have a policy, do you review it? Do you check it out, make sure it's still applicable? And do you apply it? It will not do you any good to have a policy that says anyone who interacts with children, youth, or vulnerable adults are subject to a background check every 5 years and then never do it. That doesn't provide protection. And if anything, it opens you up to greater liability because you have a policy that you didn't follow. And let me just say a word really fast about background checks for our beloved Sunday school teachers and youth group leaders and volunteers. It's important. It's important. And I know, and I've been pastor of churches where people have been offended. How dare you? How dare you ask me to take a background check? I've been teaching Sunday school for 30 years. How don't you trust me? Don't you know I'm a good person? Yes, I do. I trust you. I know you are a good person. I value your generous heart. I value everything you give to the church. And we are going to communicate to families, to our neighbors, that they can trust you too. This is part of how we are responsible in our communities. Because I know Miss Twyla, who has taught Sunday school all of her life since she was in her 20s and now she's 80. I know Miss Twyla wouldn't even pick up a fly swatter to swat a fly. I know that. But the family that just moved in down the street, they don't know Miss Twyla. And for them to come to church and say, how are you ensuring that our children will be safe when they're out of our sight and out of our presence? It is in the end a very small thing to ask, yes, even 85-year-old Miss Twyla, to take a background check. Yes, some people's feelings are hurt by that. But I do hope and think that if we are able to pastorally have a conversation, hear the concerns and fears, and respond to them, while also laying out that this is how we show care for one another, that there's a way forward. Now, what if it's a background check that pulls up something? And I've had that situation as a pastor as well. We were doing background checks, and one of the Sunday school teachers came and said, I need to let you know that you're going to find out that I had problem with money. And the person in question explained to me what had happened, explained what would show up on the background check, and we had a conversation. I knew in advance. And in this case, since the volunteer position had nothing to do with money, which was the issue, it wasn't a problem. However, we also were able to have a good conversation about why we were never going to invite that person to help count the offering. So it ended up being a really helpful conversation. They knew that they were embraced and loved as they are, even with this difficult thing in their past. And we knew where we could use their gifts and skills in ways that were responsible. So part of the policy is, what happens if there's an issue in a background check? What do you do with that? Who knows about it? How is it communicated? How is it followed up on? Going back to the policy itself, is it accessible? So again, it's one thing to say, check, we have a policy for prevention and we have a policy for protection, but no one knows where they are and no one knows what they say. So if someone comes and says, I think something happened, what do you do? So being sure that the session reviews those things on an annual basis, that the people in positions of leadership and authority, like if you have a church administrator, a custodian, people who lead and worship regularly, making sure that people know how to access those policies. Again, the prayer is you will never, ever, ever need to use them. But we're human. We have rules of discipline in the Presbyterian Church for a reason. We understand that people sin and fall short of the glory of God. And we understand that there are paths for reconciliation, for reparation, for repair. So having that clearly laid out and a way forward in the case of something hard and harmful happening, it makes a big difference for everyone, including the person who's being accused and the one who is bringing an allegation. It's hard to think about in the church, but we know too well that the church is sometimes a place where it can be easy to get away with misconduct. This is part of our commitment to doing our best to make sure it doesn't happen within the body of Christ. Okay, also around people, safe church policies that go beyond issues of prevention and protection. You talked about, I brought up, do you have a policy? Do you have a way to respond if there's a violent weather event or the building is empty and under threat? Well, what happens if something like that happens and the building's occupied? What happens then? It's good to have kind of some steps. What happens if somebody collapses during worship or, gets sick during a meeting? Have you talked through that? Do you know that, these people in our congregation are trained? They're trained with CPR, they're nurses, they're doctors, they would be able to respond. And so we want to make sure that The person who always responds to everything but has no training is not the one trying to administer CPR or do a triage check in the moment. So that's an important conversation to have. Who do you know who can respond in the moment if the congregation is gathered? Do you have first aid kits that are checked on a regular basis? Because that stuff, it actually expires. Raise your hand if you went to get a church first aid kit during a youth event because, you know, someone knocked themselves upside the head or they cut themselves, and you open the kit and the band-aids are all kind of brown and you're like, well, that's not going to stick to anything, and the rubbing alcohol is dried out and there's no antibiotic ointment, or if there is, it's kind of cake. Yeah, Pastor Miriam raised her hand, and I don't think that was, I have a comment. I think that was oh, I've been there. Yeah. So writing into a policy, first aid kits will be checked on a semi-annual basis to make sure that the supplies are usable and helpful. Who's going to do that? Also, what happens if you do need the first aid kit? Is there a report? Do you make sure that the pastor or the administrator or the clerk of session knows? That's important too. You don't want to find out a month after the fact that, you know, Johnny, when he fell at church and got his leg bandaged, actually developed an infection. And you're like, Johnny fell at church and cut himself badly enough to get an infection? What? So do you have a policy for reporting an injury? Is there an incident report? What does that look like? Again, questions we may not think about, but they can be important to detail in a policy, even if it's just one or two sentences. Also under people, and this is another hard thing to think about and talk about. Have you discussed, as the session discussed, whether there's a need for active shooter training? There have been several mass shooting events at churches. Again, the deepest prayer is you never, ever, ever have to experience that. But there are trainings available. FEMA, Federal Emergency Management, they provide active shooter trainings and risk assessment trainings for churches, for houses of worship. PDA, Presbyterian Disaster Assistance, can connect us with those things. If there are enough churches in the presbytery who say, we want to at least be aware of risks and possibilities, we want to at least be aware of what kinds of things to consider, we can set that up presbytery-wide, a training and conversation. Oh, I hate that we have to think about that, but it is part of caring for one another, trying to be aware of ways that there might be risk and there might be danger. Yeah. In the case of an emergency, do you have a way to contact every member and friend? During this pandemic, many churches have started doing sign-in sheets because of contact tracing. That's linked to this. That's part of having a safe church policy. How do we contact one another if we discover there's been an exposure during worship or during a meeting? Again, having those conversations in advance, knowing what the plan is in advance, means you're not scrambling to decide what to do in case there's a need for emergency contact. And again, who makes that decision, who carries it out, who starts that ball rolling? Knowing in advance is really important. Oh, and here's another hard one. I mentioned a volunteer who came and said, when I do my background report, this is going to show up. People who have made terrible mistakes, people who have done awful things in their lives. God loves them too. God loves us. God loves us all. So, do you have a way to respond if somebody with a record, with violent crimes on record, or something like abuse of a minor on record, wants to be part of the worshiping community? That may be something you've never considered, but it happens. So what do you do? How do you protect those who may be more vulnerable to the presence of that person? How do you protect that person? How do you help do that hedge of protection so someone is able to worship and is able to seek reconciliation and redemption through that saving relationship with Jesus? That's what we believe in. But we take the steps to provide protection so we don't increase the likelihood of a new temptation, a new terrible choice and mistake. So talking through that. Sometimes a church will have a team, usually pastor, often clerk of session, if that's somebody who is known to be wise and discerning and able to keep confidence. One or two other people to make some decisions. Some choices may be that if somebody with a violent crime on their record, or abuse of a minor on their record, is seeking to come to church, that one of these three members will accompany that person whenever they're in the building or on the grounds. And that can be done in a friendly way. It's not, a guard who's going to, watch really closely, but a friend. I'm going to be the friend who is with you to protect you and to protect others. But again, it is easier to have that conversation before the person calls or shows up and says, I'd like to come to church, but I have to talk to you about something. So that is an important thing to consider for your safe church policy. And this is true even if you are a congregation who doesn't have children or young adults in worship. These are the kinds of things that we think through now so that we are ready down the road. So you may be sitting here tonight and thinking, we haven't had a child in worship for years. And that's okay. It's still important to have a conversation because our demographics change all the time, and God is always doing a new thing. So when that family shows up, or when somebody brings their grandkids to worship because they're visiting and grandkids want to come and see what grandma and grandpa do, you are ready. You have something to refer to. So it's not just for churches with a big Sunday school or youth group. It is for all of us. All of us. All right. Last section to look at is finances, and then we'll break for questions and conversation. And I include this in the Safe Church policy because embezzlement of church finances is often really easy. It's really easy to do. We don't have good protections. And it can be really tempting. It can be so tempting for somebody who is struggling, is on the brink, and there it is. It's right there. It's right there. And they think, in that moment of temptation, they'd want to help me. I mean, that's the language we use. We want to be there for one another. So including some thought about finances in our safe church policies can be a good protection. As you know, a book of order requires that every council obtains property and liability insurance to protect its facilities, program, staff, elected and appointed officers. And this is part of our financial protection. You may not realize that the session, as the responsible council, could be sued. If something happened, if somebody was injured on church property and felt like there was negligence involved, that goes to the session unless you have trustees of the property, and then would go to the trustees. Insurance for elected and appointed officers, read elders, trustees, even deacons, helps protect you from being personally liable. So being sure that your insurance is up to date, it's adequate for your needs, it's adequate to your property. Don't lie to get a better rate. Don't downplay your property or needs to save some money, because when you need the insurance, you need the insurance. And so review that on an annual basis. Have a conversation, get to know your insurance provider. And many insurance providers will help with and have resources to help put these policies together. And some will provide training as well. So you have a resource in your insurance provider if you develop that relationship. Also, Book of Order requires that a full financial review of all financial books and records be conducted every year, either by a public accountant or committee of members versed in accounting procedures. Now, at the presbytery level, the synod level, general assembly level, we use accountants. We use an outside firm because the level of financial oversight is so much higher. It's at a greater amount. There are more moving pieces. If a church has a large endowment, if a church has a lot of staff, it, in my opinion, is worth using an outside accountant every 5 years or so. And certainly, and this is something to think about in a policy, when you change treasurers or financial secretaries, whatever language you use, to have a policy that when a new treasurer is elected, there is a full outside review or even audit, depending on your circumstances. And again, that's part of protecting one another. It protects the outgoing treasurer, it protects the incoming treasurer, and it provides that fresh start. For most of our congregations, though, electing a small group of people, 2 to 3 people, always more than one, because a committee can't be one. So 2 or 3 people to do that financial review on an annual basis. That is sufficient for most of our congregations. But you see the language, right? All financial books and records. They're not secret finances in a church. There may be anonymous gifts, yeah, but they're not secret. And so part of a safe church policy around finances can help detail how finances are kept, how a committee to do that full financial review on an annual basis, how they're elected, how they're appointed, who they report to, how they do their work. That can be part of a safe church policy dealing with finances. And then to just think through, if you have not thought through these things, there are other safety issues around finances, like how is the offering counted? Yes. and having a policy can help protect the church and protect members. Church I worked with in a previous presbytery, the clerk of session and the treasurer were husband and wife, and they counted the offering together. And there was no evidence of any kind of malfeasance. There was no evidence of any kind of inappropriate behavior with the money, but still, it was not good practice. So, do you have a policy about who counts the money, and that they really, honestly, should not be related to one another? Is the same person depositing funds and writing checks? If so, how do you provide some protection there? Who reviews that? Who checks in to make sure that things are on the up and up? Again, we are human beings. We are human, and we want to trust one another, but we also want to be careful and help protect one another from temptation. And I would recommend that anyone who's dealing with money should be subject to background checks as well. I have been in more than one congregation where somebody volunteered, I'll be treasurer, I'll be financial secretary. And later on, it was discovered that there was a history of improper financial management in multiple congregations. So just protection for you, protection for one another, to do something like a background check. And then backup systems. It's something we're actually talking about here at the presbytery. What happens if there is an accident? What happens if the treasurer's out of town and there's an emergency financial need? Who has the authority to write a check if the check signer is not around and is not available? Having those kinds of conversations in advance means you're ready, and hope there's never an emergency. But every place I've been, we've had an opportunity to exercise that part of our policy. That's a lot. It is a lot to think about, but the good news is there are also a lot of resources. Like I said, check with your insurance provider. See what kind of sample policies they have, see what kind of trainings they have, see what kinds of things they look for, so that you know that you're in line with their requirements in the case of needing to call up. I mean, our insurance policies are there in part if we get sued in the church, we call our insurance policy, our insurance provider, and they do the legal protection. That's part of the insurance. So again, making sure that our policies, our procedures are in line with their expectations makes it more likely that they're going to cover all of the expenses related to some kind of exposure to liability. The insurance board, as a specific organization, focuses on churches and faith communities. And that is the website directly to what they call Safety Central. And I will put it in the chat so you can access it directly. And this PowerPoint will be part of the resources that we post on the website. So they've got, it's actually because I was looking at their site just to think through some of the things to touch on that I was reminded of active shooter training. They've got lots and lots of resources. It is a little overwhelming. You don't need to look at it all. Start with the basic, most important pieces. And the Peace USA. Because this is part of what we have set out as important, we have also a page of resources related to safe ministries. Those are more in line with misconduct prevention and protection of vulnerable people. but they're good resources for church language, and they're policies that have been worked on by people across the broader church. So they tend to keep in mind the fact that we are predominantly a denomination of smaller churches. All right. Take a deep breath. I'm going to take a deep breath. I'm going to take a sip of water too. That's a lot. Questions, comments, things that you were hoping I would cover that I didn't get to.
Our son-in-law was an FBI special agent. He just retired, but I invited him to come down and talk with our ushers. We have a head usher every month in the church, and so he did. We thought originally, after all this church shooting stuff started, 3-4 years ago, that we would get some mace. And he said, no, do not do that. You do not know how to use it. And so it was very interesting. The one thing he did suggest was that after church starts, the head usher go down and lock the door to our basement area, which is where our Sunday school was. We're not up and running with that now, but it was. And a few other things that he pointed out, but the main thing was do not get the mace, because you'll be doing much worse job than you would if you didn't have it. Yeah. He really didn't give us any. I mean, what can you do? You know, you're a sitting duck sitting in church, honestly. Yeah. So, but that was very interesting, and they did come and pay attention, and so it was good. Yeah. Good.
And even just having, you're right. You know,
we just had somebody who was having a heart attack, and our head usher called the 911 immediately. And we happened to have a doctor in the congregation at the time. He's not there a lot, but he, God was taking care of us, and he was with him. And then they came and quickly got. But we've had people fall and hit their heads on the pew in front of them, and things happen. It's just. You do have to plan ahead,
Yeah. No, thank you.
Did you say that this presentation will be available in PowerPoint?
Yes.
Somewhere?
Yeah. Yes.
Because I think when this came across the transom to me this morning, I'm an elder in charge of property, and I've been anointed with the emergency plan, and I'm just so pleased that Lee Penninger is with me, and she has gracefully accepted the chairmanship of our plan. She's an attorney, she's a nurse, and she's had all kind of training, active shooter. She's had all that training. I'm really so glad she's with us. But when this came across to me this morning, it was talking about safe churches, and I think what was missed was we got people in here, which is HR. You got finances in, which is treasury. So all I like to do is send these presentations to these individual people, because I don't have mine is property. Okay. Mm-hmm. Safe. The people side is HR, and then we got treasury, which is finance, and they should look at these things, I think, in their plans.
Yeah. So I put in the chat the link to our website and the page specifically for training. It usually takes a day or two for me to upload the video and send Donna the PowerPoint presentation and the other resources, because I've got some sample policies that we'll post as well.
Very good questions.
Yeah.
Cindy.
Mm-hmm.
Two quick things. One, at Buckingham, we've had a defibrillator or whatever for heart attacks for years in the building. And that's just for us as well as public. So that's always, and it hasn't been that expensive to maintain. Second thing, I guess you jogged my memory from my work career. And we didn't make any mention of maybe any hazardous materials or a breakdown or a list or anything to deal with a reaction to that or someone ingesting it by, accident, medical or first responders coming into the building to know what's in the building, and then storage as well. So that may be something, especially with older buildings and some of the chemicals, and even with the COVID cleansing. A lot of those items can be quite flammable as well. So it's something to be aware of.
No, good point. And on the other side of that are allergies. And so a church my husband served, there was a child with a severe peanut allergy, so potentially fatal allergic reaction to the presence of peanuts. And so they had to be really careful and say, if you're going to bring something to share after worship and coffee hour, you must not, like, full stop, no exceptions. So those kinds of things as well. How will you as a church respond if there's a serious allergy to food, to environment, those kinds of things? Yeah, good point.
When I work in schools, they always have the thing about the cleaning supplies.
Yep.
Don't close the bathroom door and clean with ammonia. We don't want to find you there later. And where is that stuff kept, right? And is there any chance that, a curious child could get into it, just like in your house, right? Like, so those would be kind of other things. And to make sure that custodials, I don't know who other people have for custodial, but we have a lady, she's just from the church. She works really hard. She tries to do a really good job, but it's not like she's trained, right? So, you don't want to mix ammonia and vinegar. You don't want to close the bathroom door while you're cleaning, right? Like some of those basic kind of safety things might be worthy of review.
Yeah. And do you do a walkthrough? Like, before, does someone show up before you open the building for Sunday school and worship, and do a walk through the space, make sure there's nothing hazardous that's been left out. Nobody's going to have an opportunity to run with scissors or something. Little things, but little things that can make a big difference.
Yeah, we had twin skunks in our basement of the church a few weeks ago.
Oh, boy.
That was a very interesting story of how they were both dead.
Oh, I don't know if that's better or worse, actually.
Pepe Le Pew and his brother or sister were still sharing their smells. So anyway, this is very helpful, Cindy. For us, really the insurance board has been the driver for us, and we also had to have an appraisal done at the same time. And so most all of these things were covered. And the fire extinguishers and exits and all that kind of stuff, and how many we have, and checking them out. So the insurance board was very, very helpful in using that, and we kind of piggybacked on Westminster Presbyterian Church's policy that they had developed in the Presbytery resources. It took a while. It's a 60-page document. It's not short, but for us, it really was the very helpful people at the insurance board who helped guide us through it.
Yeah. And they really are. They are. That's their job. So
and for us, they required it. We had to do it.
Yeah.
We had to do it.
So we recently had a dead bat in the entryway, and it raised questions about not just the Sunday morning walkthrough, but the kind of like, we're real short staffed right now. So, when was the last time someone walked around the entire building, looked, at the steeple and looked at the eaves? It turns out we have a huge bird's nest up in the cupola, which nobody was really aware of, and then, so, okay, what do you do? Right. So then we got advice from the bat guy, right? He was a critter guy. But our building and grounds person is in, she works for the state for the child abuse and so on. And she thought of, okay, so now we should find out, like, does this bat need to be tested for rabies? Kind of what are the safety concerns there? And it turned out since no one was in, I forget the exact details, but something about where the bat was found and how the bat was already dead and everything meant that they didn't have to pursue it any further. But it was interesting to, like, I don't know if I would have even thought about, that angle of it. So,
yeah. And that's, again, I mean, I do encourage you to reach out to your insurance provider, because there are things that we won't even think about. There are details that won't occur to us. I didn't even touch on cemeteries, which several of our churches have. Yeah. So, I mean, the good news is, as overwhelming as this topic is, there are good resources and people who are the experts that are thrilled when we come along and say, gosh, we think we need to work on our policies and procedures. Yeah. And that is our hour. Oh, big topic. If you have further questions, or, as you are thinking more about this and questions come up, please do not hesitate to reach out. By the end of the week, the recording, the PowerPoint, and other resources, including at least one sample policy, will be on the training piece of the website. In September, we will be back, I believe, to Thursday. Let me check. Yep, Thursday, September 16th, 5 p.m. That's the week of the presbytery meeting, so I couldn't do it Tuesday. And in September, we're going to look at stewardship. So spread the word. And again, I'm going to try to bring some things you may not have thought of before, bring some different perspectives, so that even if you feel like we got stewardship down, my intent will be to give you at least one thing worth your while. So that'll be September 16th, 5 p.m. stewardship.
Cindy, in that context, I'm working with my church to try and figure out how financial information is shared with the congregation, and when and how much and in what form. So if you could include that, it probably fits in there naturally, but.
Will do. And what should the pastor know? Stay tuned.
Yeah, I don't know. Is there consensus on that? I get there's the whole gamut on that, isn't there?
Well, we'll touch on that. Yeah. So thank you all so much for tuning in tonight. Have a great rest of the evening, and yeah, it's good having this time with you.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.